We hear so much about presidential abuse of power. There are discussions across this country on a daily basis about Donald Trump and the manner with which he wields the power of his office. However, if we take presidential abuse of power into one discussion, and if we look at history, we find that it's nothing new. It's been going on for a very long time, and Americans might be shocked at sometimes what the presidency has done in the hands of those who wish to wield power both in a negative sense and maybe in a positive sense. That's our discussion here on this special edition of The Man in the Arena.
Theodore Roosevelt once said, "The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena."
I believe there's a hero in all of us that keeps us honest, gives us strength, makes us noble.
So that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat.
Seize the day.
Whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood. Who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, and spends himself in a worthy cause.
And I'm gonna stay right here and fight for this lost cause.
You've got to get mad.
I mean plumb mad dog mean.
Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure.
Who at best, if he wins, knows the thrills of high achievement. And if he fails, at least fails while daring greatness.
I'm gonna show you how great I am.
You mind if I give you a bit of advice? Of course, you know this because you're a smart guy. You should never make important decisions while you're upset.
You did. And American soldiers and innocent civilians are dead because of it.
I never ordered any...
Don't even think about playing that game with me. I will not let you dishonor their memories by pretending you had nothing to do with it.
How dare you come in here and lecture me?
How dare you, sir?
How dare you come into this office and bark at me like some little junkyard dog? I am the President of the United States.
It gives me no pleasure to do it, sir. As Acting Deputy Director of Intelligence, it is my duty to report this matter to the Senate Oversight Committee.
You're not going to do that?
I'm not.
No. You've got yourself a chip in the big game now. You're going to tuck that away. You are going to save that for a time when your own ass is on the line. And then you're going to pull it out. And I'm going to cash it in for you. Right?
I don't think I have anything more to say to you, sir.
The country can't afford another scandal, Jack. To protect itself, it won't allow the possibility of another deception that goes all the way to the top. You'll take the blame. Cutter and Ritter will take some too, but it won't amount to much. They'll get a slap on the wrist. And then $20,000 an hour on the lecture circuit. The rest of the blame will fall on Greer. Oh, yeah, you'll take him down with you. You'll destroy his reputation. But that's as far as it'll go. The old Potomac two-step, Jack.
I'm sorry, Mr. President. I don't dance.
The old Potomac two-step is a brilliant final scene from the film Clear and Present Danger, where a president is caught by basically lying and wielding his power in a negative sense and creating deaths around the world. Presidents have been doing this for a very long time because they make the rules. At least to them they do. They are very powerful men. We live now at a time when there is such an outcry from people that Donald Trump is abusing his power, is wielding his power in a sense that he does not have the authority to. Yet he continues to be president, and people still say that he is the one that is basically, in many ways, driving America into despair and into what could only be considered as an international incident where people are looking at America and shaking their heads. But wait a second. Stop there. Is Donald Trump the first one to do anything like this? Is he the guy that all of a sudden has brought about such danger to the presidency and used the power for his own will? Hi, once again, everybody. I'm Ed Berliner. Thanks so much for joining us here on The Man in the Arena, because that is exactly what we're going to discuss today, and it's going to be very uncomfortable for some people to hear exactly what has gone on throughout history. Oh, and you're going to learn something here today, too, which might not be a bad idea in the current society that we're undergoing. My guest is the assistant professor at the Department of Government at American University. He is a fellow at the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies. He is the author of 2 books. The first, Emergency Presidential Powers, From the Drafting of the Constitution to the War on Terror. His second book, Power Without Constraint, the Post-9/11 Presidency and National Security. In other words, he knows a lot more than I do and that you do about this. So let's bring the expert in finally. It's a pleasure to welcome Professor Chris Edelson to The Man in the Arena. Professor, thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks, Ed. I appreciate it. Glad to be on.
This is something where I believe we need to start at a very basic level before we get into some of the weeds here. Is it not fair to say that while Americans may be smart, educated, they look at certain things about presidencies and elections, that when it comes to the actual powers of the president, many people simply don't understand what they are, what they do, and how they work?
Yes, but as you're suggesting, that doesn't reflect ignorance. It reflects a couple of things. Most centrally, it reflects that it's not clear. The Constitution's not clear. The law's not clear. A lot of it's been worked out based on practice. So there's no, if somebody asks what power does the president have, there's no simple answer. So it's not surprising people would be unclear about this. And then the second reason that it's unclear, I think, relatedly, is people see a presidency play out in current vision, most prominently, that is very much at odds. Although, as I said before, the presidential model is not clear under the Constitution, but there are some clear limits. What people see on TV, especially with this president, but in other presidencies as well, as you suggested, they see something that is at odds with the constitutional model. So that's confusing too.
With regard to that constitutional model, I'm one of those people who has always said to me the Constitution is a living, breathing document. It is something that, there have been amendments to the Constitution before. It's not as if it hasn't been changed from when it was originally drafted. But let's go back to that and rules that the founders decided on when they decided on the powers of the presidency. Is it not fair to say that many of the powers that have granted, many of the issues and items and lines in the Constitution are outdated when you bring them to a 2020 time, and things have changed, and the founders could never have imagined, or at least maybe they didn't want to imagine, the highest elected official in the land misusing and abusing power in so many ways?
I think what you're saying is right. I think they did imagine the possibility of abuse of power. They had just fought a revolution against a king who they believed was abusing his power. I think what they wouldn't have anticipated was the system failing to respond. Madison in the Federalist Papers described the separation of powers, and his theory was that ambition would counteract ambition. What he meant by that is if any branch of government went too far, he actually thought Congress was the most likely candidate to abuse his power, but whoever went too far, the other branches would respond. What he didn't anticipate was partisanship. Today, if President Trump abuses his power, members of Congress will say, well, I'm a Republican too. I don't want to take him on. So the constitutional model doesn't work. And that goes to your first point. I do agree. I think the constitutional model, the framers of the Constitution were products of the Enlightenment. They understood they could make mistakes. They understood times could change. The Constitution itself was replacing an earlier national document, the Articles of Confederation, that they believed had failed. I think our Constitution today has failed as well. That doesn't mean that the entire document is worthless. There are lots of things that I think the framers made some big mistakes, slavery most prominently, but they got a lot of things right. However, as you suggest, I think what the Constitution is badly in need of updating. That's no surprise after more than 200 years.
Why then can we not get to that place? Is it that simple matter of partisanship and maybe even ignorance and laziness? You put them all together? Because if you take the argument that we just made and you just talked about, to certain people in America, they will bristle immediately. Their backs will come up. They will be as angry as hornets, because how dare you want to change the Constitution? To some people, it is an absolutely perfect document that cannot be changed, cannot be altered, and absolutely still speaks to what America is today. How do you get past that when you have such a concrete block in front of you of doing it, and at the same time, to what you just indicated, you've got people sitting in Congress who go, whether it's Democrat or Republican, well, I don't want to say anything because it's still my party, and at the end of the day, I still want my job, and I don't want to screw it up back home. There's a lot in that to unwrap.
Yeah, and there's a lot of risk involved in what I'm proposing, which I know sounds crazy, and in normal times I would never suggest this, is a new constitution. Because I think our current constitution, it doesn't mean everything is worthless. I think protections of individual rights are important and should remain. But I think in some important ways, the Constitution has simply, it's not democratic enough. Things like the Electoral College and the way the Senate works and House districts that can be gerrymandered. And there aren't effective limits on power. When a president goes too far, Congress is simply incapable of setting limits. By the way, there's no guarantee that any system will work. What I mean by work is produce a constitutional democracy, a system where there are free and fair elections. People who are elected have limits on their power. They can't do whatever they want. Their individual rights and independent courts. If we agree that's the goal, I personally think that's worth striving for. I think we can do a better job of making that more likely. I think right now, it's not clear our system will survive. It's not clear we will continue living in a constitutional democracy.
You realize, of course, that what we're discussing here right now, what you just mentioned, is heresy to a number of people, saying that you're speaking out against a free America, and by asking for a second constitution, I guarantee you right now, there are mouths that will be agape at the mere thought of that, because they will see it as a despising of America and of also fomenting some sort of insurrection.
Oh, well, first of all, I should say I certainly don't support violence. One of the things I grew up really reading about and absorbing and taking to heart American history. But one thing I always wondered about is if I had been alive during the American Revolution, would I have taken part? I'm not a violent person. I'm happy with the results of the American Revolution, that it created what became a democratic system over time. Took a lot of changes, but I'm not advocating violence. I see this as faithful to the American tradition. We have, as I mentioned before, the Constitution itself replaced the failed Articles of Confederation. The framers of the Constitution understood perfectly well that they could make mistakes and changes would be needed. And maybe even the Constitution was really what I see when I propose a new Constitution today. I see it as analogous to what happened in 1787. They saw a failed document, the Articles of Confederation, and they replaced it with something new. What I'm suggesting is really exactly what they did. I don't see it as contrary to American tradition. I see it as really in the same spirit, but taking into account the mistakes they made and trying to correct them. I do understand. I don't take this lightly. There's a lot of danger and risk involved in this. I don't think it's plausible to create a new constitution right now. I think there have to be preconditions and things have to be done in advance. The reason I raise this is because I think it's clear to me that our constitution right now is just not working. And I think people, at least some people, do see that. I think we've seen the protests recently. I think there's an understanding for a lot of Americans that something has gone badly wrong when it comes to race, when it comes to police power, when it comes to the military, and when it comes to the presidency. Yes, these are radical things to talk about. They shouldn't be taken lightly. And even I see it more as a goal to approach. I don't think the time is right now to create a new constitution. I think first people have to talk about why it's necessary, whether it's necessary, and then the next step is to decide what steps to take.
Yeah, but we've got to get there. I mean, I think that's your point, because many times, and certainly in the racial strife that we're facing in America right now, I have heard for far too long there are people who will say, when something happens, let's deal with it later. Let's wait until it clears. Let's deal with it later. We've heard about that far too many times, and we're dealing with it again with the George Floyd murder. We're finally, it seems as if we're getting to the point of saying, come on, damn it, we got to do something this time. So I guess that question will be, we can't answer it. This is all just going to be subjective on our parts. But when do we get there? When do we finally see ourselves at a point where our political process has collapsed so badly and from everybody, from mayors to governors to senators to representatives to the president, and everybody on a president's cabinet are so corrupt and graft-ridden that we've got to clean something out sooner or later. But the American public, and here's the next thing, the American voter is going to feel as if they're handcuffed. What do? I'm only one person who can sit here with one vote, and you can see that frustration that has boiled in this country on so many other issues. And it seems as if we've got to get there on this issue sooner or later.
Yeah, these are all the right questions to ask. I think people do recognize this to the extent you can generalize about 330 million people. I think Trump's election is a reflection of some of what you're talking about. I think people were saying the system is broken. It's gone so badly wrong that we might as well take a chance on a reality television star. I think that's a reflection of a kind of desperation and recognition that things are broken. And remember, Donald Trump said, that was his argument. He said things are broken. I alone can fix it. I don't think any one person can or should fix a system unless you're talking about setting up a monarchy or dictatorship, which I do not support. But I do think what's happened in the last few years, including Donald Trump's election, did reflect people's recognition that something's gone badly wrong. What I hope is that people, and I think there's signs that this is happening, that people will say, something has gone badly wrong. Donald Trump was not the right person to solve it. And in fact, he exposed new problems. But this is a chance, now that these issues have come to the front. I mean, what we're seeing with these protests is something certainly I've never seen in my lifetime. Diverse crowds, white and black people. Mitt Romney just marched, a Republican senator, the Republican nominee for the presidency in 2012, and he said Black Lives Matter. Inconceivable a few years ago for any Republican, let alone a prominent one like him, to say this. So history is contingent. We don't know which way it will go when we live through it, but I think we're at a crossroads. That can be both hopeful or dangerous. We don't know which way it will go, but I think this is a time when change is certain in one way or the other.
Professor Chris Edelson is our guest here on The Man in the Arena. Let's get to those crossroads, and let's see if indeed we're there and how we are getting there. And this will be uncomfortable for certain people to hear, because undoubtedly there are those who will claim that you and I are simply out here throwing out one political aspiration against another, which we're not doing at this point. We're looking at what is good for America and not necessarily what is good for one individual or one group of individuals. And I believe that if there's a seminal moment that perhaps needs to be looked at in depth by every American, it's when President Donald Trump made this specific statement at a press conference.
When somebody's the president of the United States, the authority is total. And that's the way it's got to be.
Total. Your authority is total.
It's total. It's total. And the governors know that.
So if
the governors know that. Now you have a couple of bands of excuse me. You have a couple.
Could you rescind that order?
You have a couple of bands of Democrat governors, but they will agree to it. They will agree to it. But the authority of the President of the United States having to do with the subject we're talking about is total.
You said when someone is President of the United States, their authority is total. That is not true. Who
okay, you know what we're going to do? We're going to write up papers on this. It's not going to be necessary because the governors need us one way or the other, because ultimately it comes with the federal government. That being said, we're getting along very well with the governors, and I feel very certain that there won't be a problem. Yeah, please, go ahead.
Has any governor agreed that you have the authority to decide when their state
I haven't asked anybody. Because I don't, you know why? Because I don't have to. Go ahead, please.
But who told you the president has the total authority?
Enough.
And I have to tell you, that is the biggest meltdown I have ever seen from a president of the United States in my career. I don't think a reasonable person could watch what we just saw over the last hour and conclude that the president is in control. He sounds like he is out of control. And he was ranting and raving for the better part of the last hour during that news conference. As John King was just saying, he's claiming that he has authorities that he doesn't have. The Constitution does not give the president of the United States total authority. And I thought it was very illuminating that Vice President Mike Pence got up there at the podium and described the president's authority as plenary or absolute. That is not the case. That is a fact check false.
Professor, let's make something very clear to the people who are watching us on Facebook Live, those who will watch us on YouTube, and those who are listening to us across the podcast spectrum. We did not change the words of President Trump. We did not put those words in his mouth. Granted, Jim Acosta's words after were an opinion of a veteran reporter. Also, there are those who will say that, Ed, you just used CNN, which is fake news, which to me is the most ridiculous statement and two words I've ever heard put together, and it shows an ignorance for what is actually the difference between clickbait media and news. We can get into that at another time because that's an entirely different conversation. But the words came out of his mouth that he has total authority. He does not, the Constitution does not call for that. And whether you love him or hate him, even if you love him and you are a fan of the president, you should still put your foot down and say, that's not my America, that's not constitutional, and that is a hard-edged government which many people have fought against. That's not what the constitutional founders wanted, which basically becomes a monarch in so many ways. That's not who you are. So if we reach that crossroads, we're there. We're now past it. We have a divided nation, which half of the people will believe that what he said was absolutely constitutionally wrong and needs to be called. The other half will say, what he said was right. Well, it may go against the Constitution, but he's right. He needs to be the man in control at all times, and that's what I elected him for. Professor, we're in the mud right now, and there doesn't seem to be any way out of this. You want to talk about a swamp? This is the real swamp more than anything else we've faced.
It's a dangerous moment, and you raise a number of really important issues. It's hard for me to cover all of them. One thing I will say, though, I agree with essentially all you said, except for one thing. I don't think it's that half of the country thinks this is okay and half doesn't. Donald Trump is a very unpopular president. He wasn't popular on election day in 2016. He didn't win a majority of the vote. Polling now shows his approval rating is even lower. But that's sort of beside the point. It could be that 90% of the country wants this. It could be that he had clear majorities that supported this kind of power. As you said, the problem is, I mentioned in the beginning, the Constitution isn't always clear. It's clear on some things. The president is not a king. The president does not have complete power. I'm glad that reporter had the wherewithal to respond to the president and say, you're wrong. She was right. He doesn't have that kind of authority. I mean, maybe he should. If people want a monarchy or a dictatorship, they can have it. I don't support that kind of thing for any president. I wrote a book criticizing President Obama for going too far. I don't think any president should have that kind of power. But the reality is, if people want to choose that, they can. I hope they won't. I think what we have to do is make the case as to why that's not a good idea. And one thing that's really been encouraging to me is a number of prominent Republicans, conservatives, and even former generals who never speak out on these things have been saying just that. For retired General Allen, now the head of the Brookings Institute, had a piece the other day where he said, something you said made me think of this. He said this may be, you were talking about we're in the mud and this is kind of the swamp right now. Retired General Allen said, we may be seeing the beginning of the end of American democracy.
That's frightening. That's scary.
Yeah, it is. But it's important to say because nothing is inevitable. This is dangerous. And it's time for people to decide where they stand. As you said before, do we want a president who we like, which could be a Democrat too, of course, for people like Trump. If they think presidents should have this kind of power, that would apply to a President Biden or Obama or whoever the president is who's a Democrat. Do we want that kind of power? I don't think the result is not final yet. As I said, we're at a crossroads. I think people should decide, is that the kind of system we want? It's not the kind of system the framers envisioned. It would be something very different. So when I talk about changing the Constitution, one thing that's dangerous is people who want that. Donald Trump could say, you're right, I don't have total authority, but I should. And he could change the Constitution to provide that kind of power. So changing the Constitution is a risky thing because the goal might be to strengthen limits on power. It could go in the other direction.
When we speak about the Constitution, and again, I've been in this situation many times, where there are people who will go back to the Constitution. They will say the founders were infallible. The founders made perfect rules. There are people who will say that nothing needs to be changed. Okay, we've touched on that briefly, but let's then go back to the founders in a matter of what we're discussing here right now. Because if you look at the powers of the president, Article 2, Clause 5, and for those watching, I'll read it. For those listening, Here it is, because these are the important things to take out of this. The Take Care Clause. This clause is meant to ensure that a law is faithfully executed by the president even if he disagrees with the purpose of that law. The Supreme Court and the attorneys generals have long interpreted the Take Care Clause to mean that the president has no inherent constitutional authority to suspend the enforcement of the laws, particularly of statutes. It demands that the president obey the law. At the end of the day, that's exactly where we're at. And there are people saying, but he needs greater authority. And that's just not the case. What many people will say then, Professor, is if this is sitting in the Constitution and we are able to look at it and people are saying that the Constitution is perfect, we love it, let's go with that, then why is nothing done? Where is the end result? Where's the linchpin that stops this from happening? The consequences that never seem to be there.
I appreciate everything you're saying. These are exactly the issues I talk about in class. I teach on presidential power, the same issues I wrote about in my books. And you would think, when I was a kid growing up, I mentioned I love American history. All the books I had when I was a kid were about American history, about American presidents, about wars the United States had fought. I've been fascinated by it. I live a couple miles from a Civil War fort. I love walking past it and thinking about what happened there. The framers of the Constitution understood, and when I was growing up, I didn't understand this. I thought, as you were saying, that it's enough to simply write something on paper. I sort of thought of the Constitution as automatic and self-executing. The framers wrote this magnificent document, and it will simply work. I thought about when I was a kid the danger of dictatorships, and I thought, well, that couldn't happen here. We have this great Constitution. What the framers understood, though, is that no system is self-executing. Madison in the Federalist Papers said parchment barriers, mere words on paper, are not enough. The system depends on, and this is the central reason why I think our system is failing right now, it depends on each branch of government, and actually the people as well. Madison said the people are the primary check on government, but it depends on each branch of government doing its job. If a president goes too far, which, by the way, as you mentioned before, has happened with other presidents. President Bush, President Obama did some of this too, not in the same ways as President Trump, but some similar issues where they went too far. When that happens, for the system to work, someone else in government, and it's most likely going to be Congress, Congress's best position to act, has to take action. They have to say this is not okay. When that doesn't happen, the system fails. When a president says, I have total authority, I can do what I want, if the president acts on that, we've seen that in recent weeks. The president was threatening to call out the military. Can he do that? People often ask that question. The answer is the president can do whatever he wants if people let him get away with it. I don't mean that in a paranoid way. I think the president himself understands there are some limits, but he's testing those limits. What can he do? How far can he go without people taking action? And the question so far has been pretty far. We don't know exactly where the limits will be.
Let's talk about testing limits and how some of these limits were set, because certainly you are, I am, many of the audience listening and watching today were here on December the 11th, 2001, when America was attacked on its own soil. And 9/11 continues to be a sore spot in this country's history for so many other reasons other than just the attack itself, what preceded it and also what came after it. But it was years later that George Bush made what I thought was an interesting statement which started a lot of this off, because there were presidential powers before George Bush, but certainly when we were attacked on our own soil, and at a moment when Republican, Democrat, Independent, everybody seemed to be acting in one voice, the American rules changed, and an American president was allowed to get away with a number of things that he had never been allowed to get away with before.
The presidency is often defined by the unexpected. There's going to be crises, and it's important to have a president who can handle them with calm resolve. When Americans woke up on September the 11th, we did not know that the world would forever change that day. I was sitting in a classroom in Florida, listening to a child read. My chief of staff, South Carolina graduate Andy Card, whispered in my ear, a second plane has hit the second tower, America is under attack. My first reaction is, that's hot. We're going to deal with these people. My second reaction when I was staring at this young child is that my job became crystal clear, and that is to protect her, her community, and her country.
Now, those are words he spoke in February of 2016. Let's go back to that, because there's no doubt that the powers of the president changed at that moment when he became more than just a wartime president. He was a wartime president on an American soil footing. But to play devil's advocate then here, Professor, is it not fair to say that there were times when the Constitution, how it was written, and I go back to it being written more than 200 years ago, that it simply does not speak to the needs of what America has to have at this time in order to move forward, because the world has evolved and changed in a dramatically dangerous sense. So maybe it's okay from time to time to let a president get away with something because he or she will need to.
It's a very interesting point. I wrote an article about exactly this issue because it makes sense. I was living in New York on 9/11. I was scared. I remember things shut down for the rest of the week. You became acutely aware that Manhattan is an island. You couldn't get off it. And the next week we walked to work when things reopened. And I remember looking over my shoulder and I expected there to be another attack. I was scared. Terrorism is supposed to be scary, and it is. When people get scared, they look for someone to take care of them, almost like a child turning to a parent, which is okay for kids and parents. It isn't so good in a democracy. So there was this idea, as you're suggesting, that, well, in fact, Vice President Cheney made this point. He said, ordinary rules don't apply anymore. We have to make sure that the United States is protected, and if that means setting aside the law, that's what we'll have to do. There's a really good documentary called Cheney's Law, available on PBS, that explains this theory.
Brilliant documentary.
Oh, yeah, it's really good. It's very well done. So I've thought about this a lot. It makes sense. Basically what he's saying is, when there's an emergency, ordinary rules are out. You just need to protect the country. That sounds right. In practice, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. When you think about American history, how many times have there been when a president had to act because there simply wasn't time to get approval from Congress? The only example I can really think of, in fact, not even 9/11. 3 days after 9/11, Congress passed a law authorizing the president to use force against al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Congress passed that law in less time than it took the president to sign it.
Record speed.
After Pearl Harbor, Congress declared war the next day. There's this idea that Congress is slow and presidents are fast. It's not really borne out by history. And fortunately, in our history, there's only been one time really when a president had to act with Congress not being able to act. It was the Civil War. Beginning the Civil War, Congress was out of session and Lincoln took action. So in some ways, the Constitution does need changing because things have changed. When it comes to emergency power, I actually don't think so. The model the framers had, it's not expressly spelled out in the Constitution, but it's clear from their writings, it's clear from the debate records from the Constitutional Convention in 1787, is that normally a president would get approval from Congress before using military force. Presidents are accountable to law like everyone else. That's what it means to have the rule of law. That's the Article 2, when you mentioned the take care clause before, that's what it means. Nobody's above law. The president's not a king. But the framers understood there are some exceptional circumstances. There could be an emergency where the president might need to act alone. They understood that. What they said at the Constitutional Convention is, in those circumstances, if the president has to repel a sudden attack, he, or someday she, can do so, and then would get approval from Congress. I think that model actually works pretty well, as long as you have, one, a president who acts in good faith, and two, a Congress that sets limits on presidential power.
As long as you have a president who understands that there is a delineating line in his or her authority and that they cannot cross it. To many people, it would seem that this president does not know the line. He is not reminded of the line. And if he is reminded of the lines, he simply ignores it because, again, he's gotten away with it to this point, so why pay attention?
That's right. That's what's different. You're right. History didn't begin today or this year or even in 2017. Presidents have done things like this before. What's different about this president, though, is I don't think he sees legitimate limits on his power. Even Nixon did. Nixon ultimately resigned from office. Certainly Presidents George W. Bush and Obama did. They went too far sometimes, and I wrote about this in my books. But they were not authoritarians. Donald Trump is. What I mean by that, that word can be confusing. I'm not saying Donald Trump is Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin. An authoritarian is simply someone who does not believe in constitutional democracy, someone who doesn't believe in free and fair elections, someone who doesn't believe in the rule of law, someone who thinks they can simply do what they want, as President Trump said in that clip you played before, who thinks they have total authority and nobody can set limits on their power. That's what's different about this president, and he's really what's strange to me about watching this is it goes to your point about the Constitution. Words on paper, the Constitution does not allow for a president to have that kind of power, but if a president takes it, he may succeed. As I mentioned before, the system's not self-executing. Somebody has to stop him. And what's happening right now, what we're all seeing is we're testing whether that will happen. When a president claims this kind of power, will he get away with it? He may not, but the situation is certainly in doubt.
Let's bring up a couple of examples here as we continue through this, because you mentioned two presidents in here that I want to make sure we discuss, and that's Lincoln and Barack Obama. Abraham Lincoln certainly came at a difficult time in American history, and he had decided to take certain actions at certain times. The Emancipation Proclamation, he issued that order, an executive order, but despite the order, and for those who are listening, we're reading from some of the documentation here about Lincoln's time. Despite the executive order, Lincoln was aware that slavery was protected by the Constitution and that he was powerless to take steps to end it except as a tactic of war under his power as commander-in-chief, because at least 500,000 slaves remain slaves, 3.5 million declared by the president to be henceforth and forever free. All right, if we're going to use this as an example of, as I titled this, power hungry or best intentions, do we not need to add into this conversation at least that, as we've intimated, there are times when presidents need to put forward what is a best intention, which the founders did not consider, because the founders were, we're going to go back and forth on history, the founders were slave owners themselves. So they didn't really take this action to say that, well, slaves need to be freed. Lincoln decided to do it. Fair to say, though, that there are presidents who maybe should be allowed some discretion. And I think you kind of touched on that a little bit. They have the discretion, but then how do we then measure that discretion against being the megalomaniac and the individual that's concerned about the people? You want to talk about a tough question. That can go on for days to discuss that.
Yes, and some of it depends on simply the character of the person in office. After Lincoln was assassinated, the Supreme Court decided a case called Ex parte Milligan. It involved a man who had been put on trial in a military court accused of basically trying to start a rebellion within the North. And he was sentenced to be executed. The Supreme Court threw out his sentence, though, and they said the president did not have the authority to do that kind of thing. In their opinion, they were careful not to criticize Lincoln. He had recently been assassinated. But what they said is, we cannot expect every president will be a Lincoln or Washington, they said. In other words, you can trust somebody to do the right thing if they're really capable and act in good faith. Not everyone will. So it is dangerous. It's a hard needle to thread. When we think about Lincoln, one way to think about it is, well, Lincoln shows that it's possible for somebody to use this kind of extraordinary power. And so we can trust other presidents to do that. Maybe, as the Supreme Court said, if they all have the same temperament as Lincoln's. The way I see Lincoln, though, is slightly different. He did act in extraordinary ways, as you point out. The Emancipation Proclamation, an executive order freeing slaves. Sometimes people say it didn't have an effect. It did, though, because it didn't free slaves in the South. Of course, that's true. Lincoln didn't control those territories. But the North was taking territory in the South. And when it took territory, those slaves became free. It really was important. Lincoln took other actions to begin the Civil War. He suspended habeas corpus, which meant the military could hold people in prison without access to the courts. What's important to recognize about Lincoln, though, so all these things, one way to look at Lincoln is to say, well, he was basically acting as a dictator. In fact, one political scientist, a man named Clinton Rossiter, wrote a book called Constitutional Dictatorship, where he said what Lincoln did was basically throw out the law during wartime. I disagree. And the reason why I disagree is because Lincoln was careful to acknowledge limits on power. For instance, at the beginning of the war, after he took these extraordinary actions on his own, suspending habeas corpus, calling up the military, blockading the South, he convened a session of Congress on July 4th, 1861. No coincidence why he chose the date, of course. And he sent a written message to Congress. And he said, I did certain things that I recognize may not have been strictly legal. That's not the language of an authoritarian. An authoritarian says I can do what I want. I have total authority. Lincoln did not say that. Lincoln said some of what I did was not strictly legal, but I did it out of necessity, trusting that I was acting in your shoes. Congress wasn't in session at the beginning of the war, and asking you now to ratify those actions, which Congress did. It ratified the actions at the beginning of the war, and it ratified the Emancipation Proclamation by passing the 13th Amendment. I think that's an important point. I think Lincoln actually vindicated the framers' model. The framers anticipated there would be emergencies, and a president could act in an emergency, but a president would have to recognize limits on power and would need retroactive approval from Congress, which Lincoln did gain.
Those who are watching can see me just chomping at the bit here for a moment, because you hit one word that I wanted to nail down here: necessity. When a president says, I see a necessity to do something, again, we're banging up against that ceiling of the Constitution, which says you can't do this, and we are thus, as an electorate, allowing one individual, whom we, a good portion of us, the majority of us, have put in office, to decide what is necessary. That, to me, also seems to be inherently dangerous, without any checks and balances whatsoever, because then you have one person, their opinion, their idea, however that may be based, what they believe is necessary. For instance, sending military armed with live bullets into a protest zone may not necessarily be the necessity that America needs.
Absolutely right. It's, of course, highly subjective. And as you've said throughout the show, and at the beginning in particular, other presidents have sometimes abused this kind of authority. James Polk claimed Lincoln was a fierce critic of Polk's. Polk's actions in the Mexican War, Lincoln said were like a king, like a tyrant. Polk created a fake emergency. He said that Mexican soldiers had killed Americans on American soil. Wasn't true. He later acknowledged that. So you're right. When someone claims they're acting out of necessity, President Lyndon Johnson did the same thing. Tonkin Gulf crisis. He said there had been 2 attacks on a U.S. destroyer, the Maddox in the Gulf of Tonkin. The second attack had not taken place. So, as I said, it's a difficult needle to thread. The first most important thing is we have former Chief of Staff John Kelly just said this the other day, who served under Trump. He said we have to be really careful about the people we elect. That's to be sure. The people are the primary check on government power, but there are several. This is a system with fallback options, with several mechanisms. People can make a mistake. They can elect somebody who's not a Lincoln.
But the mechanisms aren't working. They're not there. The mechanisms aren't working, or else they're not being employed.
That's right. So when people elect somebody who's not a Lincoln, who claims necessity when it's not really there, as you say, and abuses power, in theory, they're supposed to be reined in by the system. That's not happening right now. And that's why I come to my conclusion that the system has failed. When you have in my view, when you have somebody who rejects the constitutional system, who says, I can act with total authority, the rules don't apply to me, I can do as I choose, I can use the military when I want, I get to decide what necessity is, and it doesn't matter what governors say or what Congress says. When people say that, when presidents make that claim and they're not reined in, I think that's a failure of the system. Presidents are supposed to be accountable in our system. They're not above the law. That's the point of the take care clause that you mentioned in Article 2. When they're not held accountable, it's a failure of the system.
I want to be completely fair, because at the beginning of this show, I pointed out that while people are screaming that this is a Donald Trump issue, this is not necessarily a Donald Trump issue. This has gone throughout the history of the United States from the very first moment from George Washington forward. And while there are a number of people watching the show who are big fans of Barack Obama and his 8 years in office, as you point out in the book, and as others have pointed out, Barack Obama was no angel either, because he was another one who basically said, and I want everybody to listen to what he says in this PBS report as they use a soundbite from the president, the words that I think probably chafed at a lot of people, and still will to this day, no matter who the president is.
We are not just going to be waiting for legislation in order to make sure that we're providing Americans the kind of help that they need. I've got a pen and I've got a phone.
And he's followed through on a wide range of issues, including equal pay for women, student loans, and more recently, carbon pollution. But every time President Obama does this, he's faced backlash from those who charge that he's an imperial president. We have our own debate on the subject now with Jonathan Turley, a law professor at George Washington University. Start with you. You've made the case that these actions by President Obama have gone too far. What are you seeing?
Well, certainly he didn't start this process of the concentration of authority in the executive branch, but it has reached a level that frankly is a matter of concern. You know, our system is designed primarily to avoid one central danger, and that is the aggregation of power in any one branch. And what we're seeing, particularly in the Obama administration, is this rise of a type of uber presidency, this president who can govern alone. And when the president said to Congress in his State of the Union, I intend to effectively circumvent you, I was astonished to hear applause. It was almost self-loathing from Congress as they applauded a president who said, I intend to effectively make you a non-entity.
However, that Congress moment actually came when there was one side that was happy that he was circumventing because it would lead the other side to be angry that the president was getting involved in basically going against Democrats. Or Republicans, rather. But when the president says, I've got a pen, those are the words that I think everybody needs to listen to. Because when you talk about that uber presidency, that's him saying, I will do what I want, and I don't care what you think. So if this has been going on for so many years here, Professor, and this has gone through every administration, and Democrat, Republican, Independent, Whig Party, I don't care how you want to slice it here, but this has been going on since the beginning of American independence and the time that we started to have a government here. How do we back this off? We've spent so much time looking at it, and we've talked about the fact that there are laws and regulations and a constitution. Is it as simple as Congress needs to start doing its job more than anything else to hold a president back? Or is there something else here that tells us this is going to be our linchpin, our latchkey, if you will, to change the way things happen? Because that's the biggest complaint that I hear from people. He gets away with it. Obama got away with it. Bush got away with it. Everybody else did. And we're driving ourselves into that fiefdom, if you will, for Americans here at this point. There doesn't seem to me there's any stopping it.
They're right. Other presidents have gotten away with things. This has been building for a long time. It is as simple in theory. You said, is it as simple as Congress setting limits and taking back its power?
And yes. I say that because nothing is simple in Congress. I understand that. That needs to be said up front.
You're right. But the problem is, by now, we've seen Congress will not act. There's a famous Supreme Court opinion called Youngstown Sheet from 1952. Truman had issued an order for the Secretary of Commerce to take control of steel factories during the Korean War, and there was a steel strike. And the Supreme Court said, you cannot do that. He was claiming unlimited power. He basically said what Trump is saying about his power. He said, my power is unlimited during an emergency. And the Supreme Court said no. And there's a famous concurring opinion in that case by Justice Jackson, Robert Jackson, a very interesting Supreme Court justice. He was also a chief prosecutor of the Nuremberg trials. He had been Roosevelt's attorney general during the early days of World War II. And what Jackson said in his opinion was, we can't fool ourselves. When presidents go too far, ultimately it's up to Congress to set limits, and nothing can stop Congress from letting power slip through its hands. So the first way to respond to this should be Congress, but Congress has shown us by now it's incapable of acting. That's why I argue that we have to find new ways. I think the goal should be the same. No president should be above the law, whether, as you say, whether they're a Democrat, Republican, Independent, whatever they are. There have to be limits on power. Turley got it right. He said the system is aimed at preventing a concentration of power in any branch of government. By the way, right now we're talking about the president, but in theory, Congress or the courts could do this, could go too far too. That goal, I think, should remain the same. Otherwise, you don't have a real constitutional democracy anymore. You have something else, an authoritarian system where a president can do as they like. But I think by now we have to have learned the lesson. Congress, under the existing system, cannot act. I think there are a number of reasons for that. Partisanship, the way the Congress is made up, that senators from small states have as much representation in the Senate as large states, that House districts can be gerrymandered, that presidents can win election through the Electoral College without winning the popular vote. I think the system has to be made both more democratic, more ways that requiring people to get majorities in order to rule, and also more limits on power once people are in power. So it does require some significant changes, unfortunately, because Congress hasn't done its job. I wish we could count on Congress. That's the way the system is designed to work. It just hasn't turned out that way, unfortunately.
I think you mentioned two things in there which I think might be worthy of discussion, at least here, when it comes down to Congress and the issues that we're involved in here. The first is the Electoral College, because the Electoral College itself is, in the eyes of many, completely outdated, should no longer be part of our election process because it was basically decided decades ago for instances that are no longer necessary. One, we've got to get rid of the Electoral College before we become a nation that is truly, first and foremost, fair when it comes to electing a president. But then let's go to Congress. You brought up, in essence, gerrymandering, because, and most people, if you tell people gerrymandering, their eyes will glaze over and they will immediately say, huh? I mean, they'll be lost. But we are in this constant battle where the people who are looking to become elected to Congress are involved in changing the rules, changing the districts, saying that it is actually good for the people when it's not. They're cutting out African Americans, they're cutting out Latin groups, Hispanics, they're cutting out Native Americans, they're cutting out whomever they possibly can to make it nice and tight and white whenever they can, or to make it perfectly black to fit whatever they need to go to their district. It would seem to me that until we get rid of the Electoral College and the gerrymandering process, that we can sit here and blow smoke all day long, but we're not going to solve anything because Congress will still be just as graft-ridden as any president would want to be.
I think that's right. And the Senate, I would say, too. To have Alaska, a state, or Wyoming, a state with 500,000 citizens, have as many votes in the Senate as Texas is absurd. I think these things have to be changed. It's important to note, none of this is going to happen immediately. The election we're having this year will be an election with an electoral college, with a Senate that's based on equal voting in each state, with House districts that are gerrymandered. That's not going to change for this election. These are things I think that we have to look toward for the future. I do think it is essential to do. Yes, the electoral college absolutely has. The electoral college is bizarre because it doesn't, even if you think the framers had a good idea about it, it doesn't function in the way they intended. They intended the electoral college, which you can agree or disagree with. I'm sort of uncomfortable with this because it's a very anti-democratic idea. They wanted the electoral college to be elite men who would be chosen by voters to make independent decisions about who the president would be. Now the electoral college just reflects the votes in each state. But it doesn't work in the way the framers intended. I don't think it would be a good idea to return to their original view, but the way it works right now doesn't even reflect their original view. People who are members of the Electoral College don't have independent discretion in the way the framers envisioned. They simply reflect the votes in their states. And what that means is that we saw this in 2016, we saw it in 2000. It is now possible to win election without winning a majority of the vote, which it's so fundamentally anti-democratic. I don't think it's a good idea. In a constitutional democracy, the majority doesn't always win. The majority can't do whatever it wants. When you win an election, you can't put your opponents in jail. But I think
but there's a lot of presidents who have certainly tried.
They want to.
Sure.
That's a warning sign when you see that kind of thing. Exactly. We were talking before the show started about Hungary, for instance. There are other countries in the world where people are doing these kind of things. We should be really worried about that here. But I do think that in a constitutional democracy, winning an election should depend on getting the most votes. Right now, we have a bizarre system where you can win election to the presidency or to a House district, or even have control of the Senate without having a majority of the votes. And it's a very strange thing. I do think it needs to be changed. But again, I think people need to recognize that's not going to happen immediately. It's not going to happen for this election. This election will play out with an electoral college in place, with the Senate as it is, with House districts that can be gerrymandered. It's not going to change before November.
Okay,
and
then
by the way, I don't think that's.
Let's agree that it's not going to change before November, but we are still going to tell people that no matter whom your selection is, get out and vote. Let your voice be heard. I have said to people recently in conversations that I'm no longer 25 years of age. I've got a lot of elections left to go, but I don't think it's going to change in my lifetime. I don't think it's going to change in our children's lifetime is what I'm afraid of. My fear is that we are so stuck in this win, win, win. We've got to win. We've got to win. Everything's winning. It's all about that. It's all about this nonsensical idea, this concept that America's the greatest country in the world. Look, we want to be, we strive to be, but history has shown that we're not. We make a lot of stupid mistakes. We start with slavery and so many other things, social issues in this country. We're not perfect. But I don't know, Professor, if we're going to be able to change this with the constant pushback of people who are more worried about getting a paycheck than they are worried about actually serving the people. And there's no way to do that. We can't psychologically prove that they want to serve people more than they want a paycheck. I don't see how this is going to stop for generations, how our grandchildren may still be facing these same issues because nothing gets changed and no one really wants to change it.
Well, history is contingent, and we don't know which way things will go. That's certainly true.
But did I just drop an unhappy bomb in everybody's lap here? All of a sudden, everybody's saying, "Oh my God, it's terrible. The man's consigning us to a fate worse than death."
You made me think of something optimistic. Let me see if I can
Please
remember exactly what it was. Well, the first thing I'll say is certainly people should vote without question. Even if a system isn't democratic, their elections still matter. I think that's without question true. The next thing I was going to say about sort of what happens next, it's going to say, you were saying, things may not change. Things may not change for us. Things may not change for our children. Yeah, we don't know for sure, but sometimes there are dramatic changes, and sometimes you don't know until it happens. And I feel certainly, this was what I was going to say. You said we like to think our country is the greatest in the world. We're people like anyone else. It's wrong to think
we make mistakes.
Right. And that's what the framers understood. We can make mistakes. They knew they made mistakes and they could fix them. I think what we do have that can have a claim to be the greatest in the world is our ideals, the ideals of the Constitution, the ideals of our republic, the idea that no one is above the law. We don't have kings here. We don't have aristocrats. Everyone is equal before the law. The ideal that there are independent courts, that there are free and fair elections, that people are treated equally under the law. These are ideals we have never fully lived up to, but I think we can get closer to them, and that's where I see some hope. This is a moment where none of this is going to ever be perfect, but I think we can move closer to the goals. That's what the Constitution itself says. The Constitution says it was drafted to create a more perfect union. Not perfect, but more perfect. And I think we can continue to move in that direction. We've come a long way since 1787. There have been dramatic improvements for all aspects of society. I mean, think of African Americans and women, for one, where they are now as compared to 1787. Are things perfect? Of course not. That's what we're seeing dramatically in the last few weeks. I think this is an opportunity to continue moving closer to those ideals, which I do think are really important. And those are ideals that can lay a stake to being the most important in the world. Other countries have followed them too. Whether we will get there, I don't know, but I think there's hope that we can move in that direction.
But is it not fair to say that until we get to the point where, and let's get into Congress again specifically, because we've talked about so much of the logjam being there, but until we get to a point where an elected Congress stops wanting to beat the crap out of the other person on the other side because they are of a different belief in a political sense, we need to get to the point where the Democrats want to stop beating up the Republicans, the Republicans want to stop gouging an eye out of the Democrats. Until we get to that point where there is governing, and again, I think what I'm talking about here is pie in the sky, Professor, that because we're talking about taking basic human emotion out of it, but until we get to that point where there is a working, thinking process of, and maybe it comes down to term limits, maybe that's not a bad place to start, maybe it's time to say from Congress as well, enough of this 2-year stop, because everybody seems to be constantly running for their job every single day of every single year. That's all they're doing. They're running for the next 2 years. That's what the president is doing. Donald Trump started running for his next election the day after he was elected, basically.
Yes.
So maybe that's one way to do it in this search for answers. You can serve one term, make it 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, whatever it is, and then you're out. Because maybe that's a way, get them off the public dole, bring in some fresh ideas, bring in some fresh faces, and maybe then we have a little greater turnover to where the people that are learning, the teens and the 20-somethings now, by the time they rise to the 30s and 40s and get into an electoral sense, maybe they then have seen it, and they're not going to be as deleterious in wanting to crush people under their heels instead of serving, which is what being elected is all about.
Well, first, I think the goal you described is exactly the right one. We can't, this is Lincoln again. Lincoln says we cannot be enemies. And he was talking in the context of a civil war, so we're fortunately not at that point.
But we are enemies. We are enemies in
Democracy.
Congress right now, and even in the Senate, and between the governors and the president, constant enemies and constant lines are being drawn every day.
Yes, and that cannot be. There's a book called How Democracies Die. It's written by two professors who basically they've studied authoritarian regimes in Europe and Latin America, and they draw on their lessons, and they say we're seeing the same things in the United States we've seen in Cuba and Venezuela and Hungary and Russia and other places where authoritarians have come to power, whether from the left or the right. It's not a partisan issue. These are people who seek power, to seek total authority. And they said one of the most dangerous warning signs is just what you said. They've seen this from their research, is when someone who seeks absolute power describes their opponents not as rivals for power, but as enemies, people to be crushed at all costs. That's really dangerous, even fatal for democracy.
Which is where we are right now.
It's where we are right now, and we have to move away from it. It's no easy task. I don't have a simple answer to that. I think the beginning is, and what's hard about it is neither side wants to lay down its arms. If if one side is calling you the enemy, are you going to be the first to stop that, to say, no, I understand the other side is going to do whatever it thinks is necessary to stay in power, and we're going to still play by the rules. There are people who criticize the Democrats for that point. After the 2016 election, there was an argument that Democrats had to stop being nice, so-called. And if Trump was going to use whatever power he had to achieve his goals, Democrats should do the same thing. I mean, the system can't work if that's the case.
But is it then not fair to say what we've just discussed, what I mentioned and what you mentioned, that the first step towards bringing this country together to where we are less concerned about beating the crap out of each other and more concerned about the actual governing of this country for the good of everybody, is for the President of the United States, whomever he or she is, to be the bridge, the healing factor, the one who attempts to bring people together and say, let's stop screaming, let's start talking. We do not have that president now, because this is a president who is antagonistic and who would rather pick a fight that he knows he can't win, but in order to ratchet up the hate on a constant basis. And we've had these presidents before. Nixon was just as bad. Yes. Nixon was a guy who kept everybody at each other's throats because he knew that would help his power base. In so many ways, other presidents have done it. But until we get that executive, that chief executive, who wants to, who demands that government is of the people, by the people, and for the people, we are a lost country.
Yeah, I think that's right. Although I would say I don't like the idea of focusing on any one person. Of course, we need a president like the one you're describing. And this president, sadly, cannot be that person. He cannot reach out. James Mattis just said this in his op-ed the other day. Former General Mattis, who was Secretary of Defense under Trump, said this is the first president, Mattis said, that he's seen in his lifetime who is not interested in uniting Americans, only dividing them. So we need somebody who can at least try to unite people. I don't think it should be the president alone, though. I think we have to be careful about focusing on any one person. Yes, the kind of president you described is necessary. We also need to see this in Congress. We also need to see it from state legislators. We also need to see it from regular Americans, just people who are not in public office. But absolutely, we need to move away from this idea that the other side is an enemy. That is much easier said than done. But the first, I will say, and I'm not trying to idealize Joe Biden, a man who has more than his share of flaws, but he does speak some of this kind of language. He does talk. In fact, he's been criticized by some Democrats for this. Joe Biden says, if I'm elected, I'll work with the Republicans, and they'll see that it's necessary to do this. That's some of the right kind of language, I think. Again, he shouldn't be seen as a savior. No person should be seen as a savior, but I think you're right. We need to see someone doing this. We need to see the president doing this, and we need to see others as well to move away from this idea. We can't be enemies. We had a civil war in this country. We can't do that again.
Well, we're in a civil war right now in many ways. If we look at powers of the president and what has happened and dirty tricks and the way we are politically, we're in a civil war right now.
Well, fortunately, there's no Gettysburg or Bull Run, but we're close. I mean, we saw there were armed protesters who shut down the Michigan legislature a few weeks ago. The president was calling for the military to be used to respond to protesters. And there are some supporters of the president who have talked about using violence as well. And of course, there's been violence from some of the protesters, too. So it's a very dangerous situation. I don't think we're in a literal civil war yet the way we were in 1861, but it's as close as I can certainly remember. I think people compare 1968 as one year where there was violence in the streets and there were several assassinations, of course, Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy, and then, of course, at the Democratic Convention. To start talking about those kind of precedents shows that we're in a really serious situation. And I think you're right. We need people who can move back from this, who can say, wait a second, we are not enemies. Let's move away. Let's move back. Absolutely. That's essential.
And we need to be clear saying this too. We're not sitting here, I'm not, you're not, saying that it is all one-sided. There are Democrats who are just as ugly as anybody else. There are Republicans who are as ugly. There are those who are trying to be peacemakers in so many ways. But this crosses party lines, and this is why I think it's going to take some time to where we don't see the majority of people reaching out and trying to solve issues. It's a matter of fighting about the issues more than anything else. And I think Democrats need to come off their high horse. Supporters of Democrats need to come off it as well. Same thing for Republicans and supporters of Republicans as well. And even if you're independent, you need to come down off the screaming horse. Boy, we could get into social media here, which is another issue altogether that has helped to propagate a lot of what we're talking about here today and how it's helped to create the anger. But until we get to that point and maybe tell the president, we're not listening. We're not listening. Yeah, that might not be the bad idea.
Of course. And some people are doing just that. And it's not a partisan issue, not in a traditional sense. This has nothing to do with what you think about what taxes should be or how healthcare should be paid or the environment. It simply has to do with whether we can be a functioning constitutional democracy. And I think it's important, as you say, to emphasize not a partisan issue. There are some Democrats who are getting this wrong without question, who do paint the other side as enemies. And there's some Republicans who are getting this right. I mean, Mitt Romney, as I mentioned, sorry to repeat what I said before, he marched with protesters, as his father did before in the 1960s. And he said, Black Lives Matter. He's trying to reach out. That needs to be really supported and applauded. All these generals who have come out with these statements about the need to support constitutional democracy, rejecting the idea of using the military against American people. There are people on both sides, on all sides, who are doing these things, and they need to be held up as examples.
Are you getting a third book ready?
Sort of. I wrote a book chapter, because writing a book is such a long process. I wrote a book chapter that came out last year, and the book chapter talks about the things I've been discussing. It makes a case for why I think the constitutional system has failed and why a new constitution is needed. Maybe I'll expand that into a book, but it's hard. I'm following things pretty closely right now and doing a lot of short writing, like op-eds kind of stuff. I don't know if I'll do another full book soon, but the chapter lays out what I think about the need for a new constitution. So I was glad to do that, and it took a lot less time than writing a book. So I was grateful for that.
When you get to that point of deciding what needs to be in the new constitution, we'll put a couple of constitutional scholars in here as well, and we'll bounce that around, because it's something that I'm happy to hear, because I get in those discussions a lot with people who say, you cannot change the Constitution. And I say, yes, you can. It was written by men.
Yeah.
It is a human society. Evolution changes everything. And if you believe that we can't change it, then there's something wrong with you. there's not anything wrong with the process of the Constitution, because we need to bring it to the 21st century, and I think that's going to be difficult as long as you still have those people who will scream, keep it the way it is. I can't think of much that is still the way it was 240 some odd years ago that still works. We need to consider bringing it ahead. I want to remind everybody that I cannot tell you enough how this has been, and I promise this would be informational, educational as well, but I find far too often that very intelligent people and many people I speak with simply do not know the history of what has happened in this country with regard to the presidency. Learn it. Chris's 2 books, I think, should be required reading. Power Without Constraint, The Post-9/11 Presidency and National Security, and Emergency Presidential Power, From the Drafting of the Constitution to the War on Terror. When you read these, you will get a much better idea of what has happened in the past. And I think, Professor, we're at the point of both telling everybody and telling ourselves that history teaches us a lot of lessons. Sometimes we just don't want to listen to the lessons, yes?
Yes. Well, I'll say I wrote those books because of my love of American history. And I think of course, we have to know what the history is and recognize the good and the bad. And to me, what's most important and interesting about history is when we learn from it, what can it tell us about today? If the framers of the Constitution got things right, they, of course, as you say, they were men, they made some mistakes. I think they got some things right as well. And I think that can help us to understand, even though we're living in a different time, what we can do today.
Let's all just try and ratchet down the temperature, learn a little bit, and maybe it'll be a whole lot better. Professor, I want to thank you so much for this, because I can tell you the comments coming in from people who are watching us live on Facebook are all saying, I'm actually learning something. And maybe that's the good place to start. As long as we learn a little something, then maybe we can move this forward. I want to thank you again very much. Much success with the books. Again, we're going to continue to promote them. And again, I want to remind everybody once again that for those who are listening and those watching, the books are Power Without Constraint, The Post-9/11 Presidency and National Security, and Emergency Presidential Power, From the Drafting of the Constitution to the War on Terror. Professor Edelson, thank you so much for joining us. I hope we do this again.
My pleasure. Thank you. Oh, I'm very glad that you've done it. Thank you very much.
We'll be doing this again. Thank you. A reminder once again, hang on for just a couple of seconds. We'll remind you of where you can catch us. Don't forget, we are Facebook Live is the best place to catch us. It is on my public page, at Ed Berliner. Also, don't forget, when we finish the shows, every show is posted to our YouTube channel. Go to welcometothearena.com, and you can see all of the episodes there. Plus, we are on 9 of the basic, or I shouldn't even say the basic, I should say the high-end, the high-level audio podcast platforms, which you'll find out here momentarily. So make sure you follow us there. For Professor Edelson, for all of us here, I'm Ed Berliner. Thanks so much for joining us, everybody. Be safe, be healthy, and be willing to learn. Until we meet again next time, I'm Ed Berliner. Rock on, true believers. For story ideas, comments, start some interesting debates, or just get in touch, join me on social media at Berliner Speaks on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Also join me on LinkedIn for business and also sponsorship discussions. There you can search out Ed Berliner. Reminder that all of our episodes on Man in the Arena are available on YouTube. Just go to welcometothearena.com. Every episode of Man in the Arena is also available on audio podcast on all of the major platforms. This has been a presentation of Entourage Management, LLC and Entourage Media.